Namaskar and good morning and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in different parts of the world. From Kathmandu at Forest Action, this is morning for me, so very warm welcome to you, all of you, on this webinar. It's almost, I think, 40 years or roughly 4 decades have passed since many of you started thinking about community forestry, community-based forestry, participatory forestry, decentralized forestry, whatever, as against the top-down, centralized, bureaucratic management of forest in those days. And in these years, at least in Nepal, we are increasingly facing a number of challenges around community forestry and community-based forestry, not only from changing socio-economic context and changing forest people relation, but also from policy context, policy debate, and in its relation with the market, on its key objectives or institutional forms. And there has often been an increasing tension between communities and states. So we thought it is good to learn from some of the early experiences, early insights, and struggles in those days that would enlighten us even this time on choosing and exploring and shaping our future of community forest. Actually, we need much more innovation, experimentation, piloting these days, and we are sure in those early days, many of you have gone through those difficult times to establish these ideas, institutions, and practices. And many of us, particularly in the academic institutions, who are familiar with the books and papers written in those days, and it would be a good opportunity for many of us to directly interact with some of you who actually started those initiatives in the late 70s or early 80s. This event is jointly organized by the ACIR supported InLift project. Many of us are associated with that project here, and also plus Association of Agriculture, Forestry and Environment in Australia, Association of Nepalese Agriculture, Forestry and Environment in Australia. I'm very glad to see a wide range of people here, including TBS, Stephen, and Don and Kajidai, and to the very young and actually who are still studying community forestry in universities and colleges here in Nepal and elsewhere. With this welcome, I will pass it for the first introduction of the detailed program and the speakers to my colleague, Dr. Hemant Oza, who is currently associated with working as associate professor at the University of Canberra and also part of InLift project. So maybe Hemantji, you would like to take on.
Thank you, Nayaji. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Most of you, I guess, in Nepal. So good afternoon. So Naya, you already highlighted the broad idea of this program. I feel immensely proud to be part of organizing this. Given that we have such a distinguished, highly experienced, internationally respected, nationally respected, and our seniors, mentors, in different stages of our own work. So to have those 4 speakers with us talking about the history and early origins and early push, through which today's community forestry evolved. We all know, and we are, part of this program in different ways, as researcher, as practitioner, as policymaker, that Nepal's community forestry has come a long way, 40, 50 years of at least formal history. If we start counting from when it became, a formal part of the practice. But then, recently, maybe in the past 10, 15 years, we have also seen a lot of change in the context of livelihood, economy, politics, governance in Nepal, all impacting community forestry. But still, it is emerging. It has proven its resilience. There are some challenges, somewhat, peculiarly similar challenges, maybe compared to what we had 30 years ago, especially around the relationship between communities and government, so there are some similarities and continuities as well, but then a lot of new challenges has also emerged. So we thought it would be really, really interesting and inspiring to have this kind of webinar with our living memories, with our living experts uh, in Nepal as well as outside. So we thought it would be a good idea to host this webinar. We have 4 speakers, TBS Mahat, Stephen Midley from Australia, Naran Kaji Shrestha, now from Nepal itself, and Don Gilmer from Australia. So all of these figures, of course, are well known to us, but I will highlight why what we could actually expect from their brief, presentation talks from each of them. So after these 4 presentations, each will be, around 12 minutes of initial talks, followed by questions and answer sessions. We are not actually inviting commentators to present live using video, but we request every participants, any commentators, to put their comments in the chat box, and Dr. Naya Sharma and myself, we will try to bring those questions in front of the speakers. So that way we will have that interactive session as well. And then towards the end, we have 2 specially invited commentators. One, Dr. Srijana Boral, to actually share her, reflections and responses, listening to our speakers, and also in view of the discussions that will follow. And like that, we have another distinguished commentator, Dr. Sindhu Dungana, who is Joint Secretary with Ministry of Forest and Environment. So we will also invite him to offer some comments and reflections on this webinar towards the end. So that way, we will proceed to the end. And our colleague, Dr. Ian Newberg, who is Associate Professor at University of Adelaide and currently active in research in Nepal, he will offer some closing observation. So that is the program structure. So without taking further time, I would now like to invite our first speaker, Dr. TBS Mahat, well-known figure in the field of community forestry and environmental management in Nepal and outside. He was a district forest officer in the 70s, at the time when community forestry was just beginning to emerge. He is, of course, one of the leading pioneers of community forestry in Nepal, working from within the government system. He did his PhD from Australian National University, and he also has a number of scholarly publications. He's probably the first senior forest officials from Nepal who has so many and such a high quality research publications as well, while working in practice in the district level in Nepal. And in the later stages of his career, because of his strong academic and research credibility, perhaps, he was invited as the professor within Tribhuvan University's Institute of Forestry, and he became dean. And I think he retired some years back from that position, and his work has been acknowledged by highest, prestigious governmental awards. For example, Lifetime Conservation Award by the President of Nepal. So we are very delighted to have such a senior and distinguished, presenter talking about the early origins and history of community forestry. So, Professor Mahat, we have very simple questions for you to reflect. How you became involved in that kind of deviation from the standard practice, because that time we know from what we have heard from you and others that it was a really top-down centralized forest governance system. But then you brought those alternative ideas, different ideas. You raised the point about engaging communities as part of forest management system. And I was looking at your CV. In 1978, you wrote a paper about an approach to community forestry development in Chautara. It was 78, when you were writing about community forestry approach at that time. So could you just, could you share your reflections, your memories, whatever you want to actually say? We don't have any prescriptions, just share your insights, your memories to inspire emerging professionals working in community forestry, both in Nepal and outside. Professor Dr. TVS Math.
First of all, Sabaina Namaste. Hi, March. How are you doing? And thank you very much, Forest Action, for bringing us together with my very old mates, Stephen Misley. Who else are there? I can see. Don Saab, Namaste. Ani हाम्रो नारायण काजी साहब हुनुहुन्छ हैन यस नारायण काजी साहब स्टिभन मिस्ले साहबलाई त मैले भने नमस्ते अनि अरु उहाँ चाहिँ नारायण पौडेल नारायण पौडेल अच्छा अनि मैले ल सबैलाई नमस्कार र नमस्ते छ यहाँलाई I would like to welcome you to Nepal on online. I hope you can make it soon as possible. So definitely Nepal. Some from Nepal, of course, and some have so much contributed to Nepal and lived in Nepal. So we always have got all those good old memories of you, as well as the contribution that you have made to Nepal in greening Nepal. Okay, greening Nepal. So with that, I would like to express my gratitude to Forest Action for bringing us together this morning. And so now I don't know, where do we start? Can somebody guide me?
अब हजुरले चाहिँ त्यही हो त्यो बेलाको परिस्थितिमा यो सामुदायिकको कुराहरू अलिकति कसरी तपाईले सुरु गर्नुभयो आइडिया के थियो अनि तपाईलाई के अप्ठ्यारो भयो कसरी त्योबाट चिरेर अगाडि जानुभयो यस्तै कुराहरू अलिकति शेयर गर्दैन न
मैले
10 मिनेट जतिमा मोटामोटी गरौँ अनि पछि क्वेशनको आधारमा क्लियर गरौँला
हजुर अब मैले पहिलो कुरा चाहिँ अब नेपालीमा यहाँसँग नेपालीमा बोल्दै छु हैन अब यहाँ नेपालीमा बोलाम कि अस्ट्राइनमा बोलाम, अङ्ग्रेजी भनौँ कि अस्ट्राइनमा त्यसो गर्दाखेरि
मिश्रित भाषा गर्दा होला, मिश्रित गर्दा कुनै नेपालीमा सजिलो भयो नेपालीमा, तर अङ्ग्रेजीमा पनि अलिअलि फटाफट गर्न पायो भने सजिलो
नेपाली पनि हैन, तर I will start, I try and speak in Australian, है त ल हुन्छ। To start, let me say, of course, I have got the person with whom we got started early in the earliest stage, I should say. We don't have with us this morning Tony Fun site. Of course, there were earlier on other Australians who have worked in Nepal and contributed in the field of forestry, reforestation, as well as I've read about them. I have met some of them in the past. I think that was in 60s, mid 60s, somewhere there. But then it was Tony Funside, Anthony Funside, who came to Nepal, whom I met in Nepal. That was in, again, as I said, early 70s, 1974, perhaps, 1974. And then he was the leader of Nepal-Australia Forestry Project at that time. We have like a very tangential touch with the Australians forestry, because they were working with the focal organization they were working with was the Forestation Division of Forest Department of His Majesty's Government of Nepal then. So that was how we started, and they were spread over Nepal, right from the east to the west, right from Mechi to Mahakali, if I may say. They had species working on, as I remember, they were working on particularly on species trials, forest tree species trials, and much of it was, I should like to mention that it was eucalyptus. They were trying and see if eucalyptus work here, and if we can introduce there. That was it. So from then on, when got with Tony, and we just happened to meet in one of the parties that he had thrown for foresters and other people in the development, people as involved in development agencies. So I was based in Chautara, but I think we have met once or twice with him, perhaps a couple of more times. And I was also invited. So that was the sort of, I'd say, the beginning of direct association with the Australian in person, I would say, with the Tony Funside. As I said, it was in 1974 or 74 it was. Then again, we were talking about various things, of course, forestry. And he said, he did mention, I think I still have the first report that he wrote for his organization. Was it IDAB? IDAB, I think I didn't. So he was writing that, Australian Assistant Development Bureau. So he sent me a copy of that as well. And then he said, I remember that para or sentence where he said that we hear that there are some new things are coming up, being done in the Chautara Forestry Division. Chautara Forestry Division, you know, these are the two congruent districts of Nepal, what you call Kathmandu, east of Kathmandu, Sindhupalchok and Kabripalanchok. And that also became, for all those there, continuing, starting from somewhere there, first informally, then formally. So we had a informally, we got started in 74, as I said, and then formally in the form of a one of the largest, I will not say in area or in this one, but there was the first project in community forestry that came in Nepal with external assistance, bilateral assistance from the Australian government, and with the project MOU got signed in 1979 September, 1979. Formally that was one, but before that, as I said, Tony Fonsite gotten started with us in 1974 or so, and Stephen Misley, which fortunately we have. I'm pleased to be really with him this morning again, with all the others, but definitely with him very much. So he was here in Nepal at that time, the initial stage of that program. Formally working with the people, you know that Steve is a jolly good man, keeps everybody laughing and enjoys, and people really like and love him. Loved him. I remember Shashidhar Timimsina, if you remember, Shashidhar is now no longer with us, but his son and daughter, they are teachers, and they remember, and I'm in touch with them, and they keep remembering the good old days. So with working with you and with the Nepal Australia Forestry Project. So this is how the 1974, and then informally we got for up until 1979, mid 1979, and then the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding between the Nepali His Majesty's government of Nepal then, and then the Australian government got signed in September 1979. Now that is one of the longest bilateral project. Multilateral projects are anyway short term and maximum 5 years, and then they may continue in some cases, but bilateral projects continue much longer in several cases. Nepal Australia Forestry Project, with the assistance of the Nepal Australian government to Nepal, it continued for 30 long years. Started in 1979 formally, and we went as far as, I think, 30 years, 29 years and few months, I would say, with the insurgency, the Maoist insurgency coming in, and the project got stopped. We could not continue with. It was not really possible to execute the development activities in the field with the Maoist insurgency. Everybody was, in fact, we were all, of course, in Nepal, scared of. We didn't want to get killed, and so going to the field and all that was very limited, hardly any much. So that was. But by that time, of course, I had left the project area, this Sindhu Palchok and Kabri Palanchok administrative districts of Nepal, and this is the operational area of Nepal Australia Forestry Project with the headquarters, field headquarters. My headquarters as the divisional forest officer there. That headquarters of the DFO, or the divisional forest officer, was based in Chautara, and so that was my headquarters, or it was our headquarters on the HMT side for that area, and government forest department, Chautara Forest Division. That was the headquarters for that, for both the administrative district, but forest DFO office was based there. And that was also the operational area. That became also the operational area formally when the MOU was signed between the Administrative Government of Nepal and the Australian government, IDAB, Australian Assistance Bureau. Now this one, so that was also because field headquarters, I would say, for the Australian project, and the operational area was all those 2 districts. So that was the first Nepal Australia forestry project, was the first development.
म हजुरलाई अलिकति यहाँनेर पज गरौँ ल म सर अलिकति पज गरौँ ल किनभने हाम्रो टाइम पनि अलिकति सकिन आट्यो हैन पहिलो राउन्ड फेरि पछि हामी
एक त फेरि मास्टर परे त्यसपछि
हजुर हैन ठीक छ एकदम ठीक छ सर अलिकति अब नेक्स्ट 2-3 मिनेट म सर मैले हजुरलाई चाहिँ यो हेलो
that's how we got started. So we have people, the earliest people that I have worked with. Stephen is with us. Mr. Stephen Misley, His Excellency is Mr. Misley. I mean, he is with us. So he's there, and I've got other people also whom I have known. We have got introduced to later, much later though, but I have known them well. Like I will say here, Dr. Don Gilmore. Namaste ji. Namaste.
हजुर म्युट हुनुहुन्छ अहिले फेरि गरौँ ल म एउटा क्वेशन राख्छु हजुरलाई
Gabriel Campbell. I would have in fact liked Gabriel Campbell. He's an American US citizen, lives somewhere in North, I think. So I should have liked him to join here also, but he's not here. On another person, when the project got signed, it was one of the Campbells, the top Dr. Robert Campbell. He was when the project formally got signed, he was the project manager. Of course, he was very much responsible. Him and I worked together. We locked ourselves in my living room. We used to lock ourselves for a couple of 2 or 3 hours together, talk, and he was the one in writing. And so the formulation stage of that project went on like that. So and when the project got signed, what you call MOU got signed, I represent the His Majesty's Government of Nepal as the project manager, and Rob Campbell was the team leader of the Nepal Australia Forest Project. And Professor Griffin, I should like to definitely refer to my guru, who was my PhD, what you call the research supervisor.
Sir, अब हामी एकछिन पज गरौँ ल यहाँनेर.
So this is it.
हजुरलाई अब अर्को राउन्डमा अहिले हामी आउँछौँ हैन. अर्को राउन्डमा आउँदाखेरि चाहिँ हजुरलाई एउटा प्रश्नहरु यहाँ के आइरहेको छ भने अब यो एकदम राम्रो हिस्ट्री हजुरले राख्नुभयो हैन. So one question that is coming to you is what sort of problem or challenge you experienced while you were working as the DFO at that time, and how you began the
I think the experience challenging experience
अर्को राउन्डमा इन्भाइट गर्छु है. अहिले अर्को राउन्ड हजुरले यो सोचिरहनु होला. अर्को राउन्डमा इन्भाइट गर्छु. अब
हजुर मैले एउटा यहाँलाई यो किताब
हजुर
यहाँकोमा सायद पुगेको होला र यो किताबमा सुरुका दिनका मेरो चाहिँ यसको अब नेपालीमा अलि लामो छ. नेपालको सामुदायिक वन विकास प्रयासका ती प्रारम्भिक दिनको अनुभव र अनुभूतिहरू भनेर लेखिया छ. लामो छ टाइटल नेपाली बुझ्नेलाई. अङ्ग्रेजीमा पढ्दाखेरि अस्ट्राइनमा पढ्दाखेरि द इनिशियल डेज अफ नेपाल्स कम्युनिटी फरेस्ट्री भनेर यो किताबमा सुरुका दिनमा मैले चाहिँ त्यसमा गरेको छु. I have tried to translate my experience as much as possible in this book. अब so this is त्यो सुरुको मैले भन्न चाहे र
हुन्छ. अब यसो गरौँ सर, म सर मैले हजुरलाई एउटा रिक्वेस्ट गर्छु ल. अब यो हजुरको एक राउन्डको प्रेजेन्टेसन सक्यो. वी विल कम ब्याक अगेन फर डिस्कसन. अब यस्तै गरी हामी सबै अरूहरूले एक राउन्ड प्रेजेन्टेसन गर्नेतिर हामी जान्छौँ र हजुरको त्यो बुक पनि इज बिकम नाउ इट हैज बिकम पार्ट अफ योर प्रेजेन्टेसन व्हिच इज भेरी गुड हैन. धेरैलाई थाहा पनि छ, थाहा नपाउनु भएकोले पनि थाहा पाउनुहुन्छ. त्यसो हुँदाखेरि फर्स्ट राउन्डको यो कन्भर्सेसन प्रेजेन्टेसनको लागि धन्यवाद. हजुर धन्यवाद. अब म I would now like to invite Stephen Midgley, who actually came to Nepal in 1976, and worked for 5 years. Dr. Mohat also referred to him. He collaborated with him on these different projects. That was his Nepal experience long back at the time of when community forestry discussion was happening. He is now a senior fellow with the University of Melbourne. He has over 40 years of experience in international forestry development as well as overall rural development. He has also worked within Australia as senior forestry specialist. He has been a long time expert panel member with FAO on different aspects of forestry. His work experience actually covers East Asia, Africa, Australia, and of course, South Asia. So with this introduction, I would now like to invite you, Stephen, for your reflections, and memory of your, time in Nepal when you were working with TVS Mahat and of course others, and of course the local communities in Nepal. So over to you. You will have around 12 minutes for your initial reflection, and we'll come back again for any questions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Hemant, for that very generous introduction. Namaste, Sabjanamacheru from Australia. I had very happy times in Nepal, and I had very happy memories of the place, which I found professionally and personally very rewarding. I arrived in Nepal in 1976 from Laos, and soon became acquainted with this very outspoken, articulate, and inspirational divisional forester, Tej Bhadar Singh Mahat. Namaste, Mahatji. At the time, Mahat was very frustrated because nearly all of his reforestation budget for the entire Chodra Forest Division was spent on barbed wire, and which had to be imported from India at great expense. And not only that nearly all of his operational expenditure for the forest guards had to be spent watching the barbed wire to make sure the communities didn't steal it. So, in fact, all of the forests continued to disappear, and we were in fact paying India to try to protect our forests from people stealing the wood. And Mahat saw a great lack of logic in this. And I came face to face with similar lacks of logic. I recall in late 76, I was measuring some plots up in Daman, and the forestry officer who was accompanying me spent nearly all of his time chasing and apprehending poor villagers who were collecting firewood at the time. And you all know it's very cold in Daman, and you need a lot of firewood. So fostering, the point I'd like to leave with you, fostering institutional change takes a long time. Steadily, bits and pieces of the rationale for community forestry began to fall in place. We were lucky because Mahatji and the family lived in Chodra. He wasn't a Kathmandu-based DFO. He was a great trekker, a great walker, and he wanted to listen to the stories the communities had to share. And after time, his arguments began to find some early support in Baba Mahal, and he found a very willing audience in our late friend and colleague, Tony Fernside, God bless him, and the rest of the Australian team at the Nepal Australia Forestry Project. But I think it's also useful to remember what was happening regionally at that time, because we were making these steady initial progress towards community forestry. And at the time in 1976, the FAO regional conference in Manila the FAO called upon member states to initiate and promote forestry for community development in the region. In 1977, we had FAO hosted the Asia Pacific Forestry Commission in Kathmandu, and for the first time, community forestry was on a specific agenda item. Then in 1978, we had the World Forestry Conference in Congress in Jakarta, where the theme was forestry for people. So Nepal was there at the forefront. Other people were talking about it at conferences, but Nepal, we were trying to do it and trying to start it. I just was reading the other day a paper by one of our old colleagues, Keshaman Bhattacharya, who wrote a national forestry plan. And in 1977, he wrote that fragmented woodlots will be directly managed by the people themselves as individuals or organized political and social bodies. The Nepal Nature Conservation Society at that time had an advertisement from the afforestation, sorry, I wonder if I can get this into focus, afforestation section on the back, which said, we help and appreciate everyone who wants to give a hand towards greening Nepal, plant more trees, care for them, and make our country evergreen. So look, and we had a saying in the newspapers and things, Harioban, Nepal ko dan. The point I wanted to leave with you is that a lot of that early work was happening, and it takes a long time to make these changes. And interestingly, that one of the early advocates for community forestry in Nepal, one of the converts to Mahat's way of thinking, was an American forester called Merv Stevens. And Merv left Nepal and went to Bangkok to establish Rekoff at the campus of Kasetsat University. And he took all that experience we had begun to develop in Nepal with him. And even myself in 1984, I went to Sri Lanka as a team leader for a community forestry project, and I took all that experience that I'd learned in Nepal, I took it with me. So I guess Nepal taught us a lot. But there were many early leaders and willing communities in Sindhupalchok, and these really deserve mention. In the panchayats of Tokapa, where Nil Prasad Bandari offered strong support. And he, in 1978, created a women's committee to help look after remnant forests. And in Banskaka Panchayat, Lakshman Dong Taman, a lovely bloke and a man of great vision, he offered similar support. Progress was slow. Communities didn't trust government officers. And Mahat's role was more of a roving diplomat than a traditional DFO. Our project efforts leapt ahead through the support Mahat received from Dr. Rob Campbell, who was a great visionary, and the project support team from the Australian National University. Mahat mentioned Ken Shepherd, he mentioned David Griffin. They were all willing to listen and contribute and develop the conceptual framework for many more years of support of community forestry in Nepal. They were very exciting times. And Hemant, you've asked me, what do I think of the key drivers to facilitate the shift away from top-down to community-oriented forest management? And I think it's a combination of cost, the logic, and common sense. It was impossible to maintain a command and control system for management of forests in the foothills of Nepal. The range and beat forest officers, there were few and far between, and communities very rarely engaged with them. The problem was too large and official resources too small. The intellectual logic for engagement with communities became obvious. We had successes in Baskaka, Tokapa, these places that gave us confidence that the communities could be trusted to look after their own forests. Operationally, we found that a village nursery with an associated water supply was a very useful focus for community forestry dialogue and work. People were very pleased to drop in and have a rest and have a drink of water and chat about trees and forests, and begin an understanding that foresters were not the enemy. The sympathy emerged within the government of the day to modify practices, policies. And I mentioned to you the changes in the policy from 1977 with the National Forest Plan. And we had to develop a regulatory framework that would facilitate this community development. So in this period of mid-1970s, there was a lot going on, and it laid the foundations for the good things which were to come. So that's a summary of my 5 years in Nepal, Amatji. I could keep you going for many more hours. I can tell you.
Namaste.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stephen Migle. That's very, very interesting. Very inspiring to hear your reflections. I think without any further delay, I would now like to invite Dr. Don Gilmer, our third distinguished speaker. Don Gilmer is currently Associate Professor with University of Sunshine Coast. He has extensive experience of community-based forestry, community-based natural resource management in Asia, Pacific, Africa, and even Latin America. He came to Nepal in the 80s, perhaps soon after Stephen Migle left, or I don't know what sort of overlap you had at that time. And Don is the founder, is one of the founder and subsequently the chair of RECOFT based in Bangkok, the Center for People and Forest, many of us know. And Don's work is very famous in Nepal and internationally on community forestry. Gilmore and Fisher 1991 is the classic book on community forestry philosophy and practice. And Don's work has actually pushed initial ideas of community forestry, which Dr. Mahat and Dr. Migle mentioned, to new levels through action research, policy linkages, and institutional development. And he remains active in different ways with Nepali research community till date. Over to you, Don, to connect us back to your old days and of course to the contemporary as well, as far as time allows. We have 12 minutes roughly for this. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Namaste, and Sabale Namaskar. It's lovely to be here, and thanks very much for Forest Action and others for organising this event and for inviting me to participate. I frame my comments around the questions that Hemant suggested for us, and I'd like to share a screen and put up a few talking points and then speak to them. I'll just try to share screen now. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Can the host enable me to share my screen, please?
Yeah, Raulji, Nayaji, yeah, could you enable that?
Yes. Don, you can do now.
Okay. Is that up now?
Not yet.
Can you see that?
No, not yet.
Oh, share, okay. Can you see that now?
Yes. You would like to go to slideshow mode.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that okay now?
Good.
Yes, brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, let's go then. Before talking about around the talking points that Hemant gave me, I think it's important to look at the context in which you're operating. I went there to Nepal in 1981, so a year or two after Stephen left. But the context, I think, is really, really critical. First of all, we need to remember that there was widespread acceptance at the time that the Himalayas, the whole of the Himalayas, were in the midst of a massive environmental crisis, and the notion of this became known as the theory for Himalayan environmental degradation, coined by Ives and Messalay. And that dominated almost everyone's thinking in a policy sense. The initial perception is that the major problem in the Himalayas was deforestation caused by ignorant peasants who were cutting down all the trees on which they depended. So the solution was seen to be reforestation and teaching people to protect forests. Of course, in hindsight, we can see that that's an extremely naive perception, but that was almost the driving, dominating perception of the time, and it dominated a lot of thoughts and actions. Prior to the 1980s, most attempts to establish plantations had pretty much failed, as I think Stephen indicated very clearly with his talk about barbed wire and so on. But Taj Mahat had demonstrated that forests without fences were possible in a couple of places in Central Polchok, subject to substantial engagement and dialogue and discussion with local community leaders. And so that really was a very seminal leap forward. That this could be done, that forests could be established without fences, conditional on certain things being taken. Now, the other part of the context is that there were a number of village leaders in Central Polchok in particular, and Steve mentioned them, Neil Prasad Bandari and Tokapa, Laxman Dong Tomang in Baskaka. They were very vocal and articulate people who had good political influence as well by the local politicians. So the end point of this context is that the focus for the first few years of work in the early 80s as the new phase of the project started to crank up was on restoration of forests, using nurseries and plantations accompanied by extensive engagement with community leaders. So that's basically the context within which the next decade or next half a decade was played out. Hammond also asked me what were the challenges around forest governments at that time in the early to mid 1980s. And really the mandate of the Forest Department at the time was one of policing and licensing. It was a policing and licensing organisation, and that's what people, foresters, were taught about in their studies. And this made it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to engage with communities in a collaborative sense. There was little trust. Basically, there was no trust, I'd have to say. But there was started to become a policy opening, and Steve talked about some of the moves that were taking place regionally and globally, as well as the forestry plan, the forestry policy of 1976, I think. But in 1978, there was the Panchayat Forest and Panchayat Protected Forest Rules and Regulations. And this really was a landmark shift in the thinking of policymakers at the time. But it also constrained attempts to try anything outside this framework of the Panchayat structure. So the focus of activities had to be on the administrative political units of the time around the Panchayat. So it was a positive move in some aspects, but also it was a constraining move in other aspects. The other thing that started to become apparent fairly clearly, even though nurseries and plantations were demonstrably successful, we could make these work as time went on, and the scale ramped up quite a lot. We're planting ultimately several thousand hectares of new plantations a year, about 75% of which survived. And you can see the remnants of those plantations around the two districts now. But it also became pretty clear that this was not sustainable in the long term. It was okay, well, a good input of technical and financial resources from outside, but really could not be sustained internally within Nepal. So this raises a question, well, what else is needed? Something else needs to happen if it's going to be sustained and carried forward. Hamanji asked what our motivation was. And I think it's probably reasonable to say that the engagement for most of us in Nepal was more than, always more than just a job. It was much more than a job. It was a vocation. And I think also there was early recognition that we were on an intellectual and a practical journey of discovery. And that if this was successful, it could lead to a whole new way of conceiving forest management. And this is a pretty exciting prospect to be engaged in. And I think most people who came to the project over several decades, really, from the mid 70s to certainly the mid 90s and beyond, there was a cohort of people there who really bought into this notion that we were really on a quite a fantastic journey that could transform the whole hills. And I think, as time has shown, that in fact has taken place, albeit there are many problems along the way. Now, what were the factors behind the early evolution of formal community forestry? So moving from the ideas, the early conceptualization in the 1970s through to the late 1980s, over a 10-year period, community forestry evolved from a fairly vague, amorphous type of idea through to something far more concrete that had more substance to it. And there are a number of factors behind this. You could write books on this, of course, but I've tried to highlight half a dozen or 10 of the most important factors. First of all, as I alluded to before, there's a highly motivated team of expatriates and Nepalis, including many of the DFOs, who are prepared to take risks and spend a lot of time in the field talking with villagers. I think this really is fundamental. A lot of people coming to Nepal spent most of the time in Kathmandu enjoying the cocktail parties and the social around, and not much time in the field talking to villagers. And I think that ability, willingness of people, along with the DFOs, to be in the field, talking with villagers is really quite critical. And Mahat, of course, set the early stage for that in early years. Also a recognition, I alluded to this before, there's a recognition that the demonstrably successful nursery plantation program was only going to go part way towards developing a successful community forestry modality. It was useful, important, certainly a very good entree. People were very happy with it. Government was very happy with it. There was something happening on the ground. But those of us who thought about it a bit critically realized that this just simply was not sufficient. Another point is that there were always some people in the bureaucracy who were very supportive of finding a better way of managing forests in the hills. Not everyone wanted to buy into this, but there were enough people in the bureaucracy from junior levels right through to senior, very senior levels, who were prepared to have a go and prepared to let us try all sorts of interesting things. I think we were extremely fortunate in the project in that we had a project management structure and project senior managers and the likes of particularly David Griffin that allowed for us to have a great deal of flexibility in implementation. We had the ability to change course quickly when new information came to light. Now, many projects do not allow that. In the present day and age, it would be just about impossible with the overtake of managerialism into the way projects are conceived and managed. But at the time, we're perhaps lucky in that things were not as managerially professional, shall we say. There was a lot of flexibility and we could do things and have a go, and we were not frightened to make mistakes and to learn by our mistakes. We also recognized that we only had a vague idea where we were going. There was a lot of grey and not much black and white. This led us to a conceptualization of what subsequently became known by the late 80s as action research. As we saw this as a valid modus operandi. We're prepared to recognize we didn't know all the answers at the outset, unlike many people like to do these days, but we're prepared to articulate a plan, try it out, learn from the experiences, and rejig the plan. So action research, participatory action research, etc. We articulated this by the mid to late 1980s. I think this was really important because it permeated the whole of our thinking and actions within the project team. By the mid 80s, we realized that the technical solutions, which we demonstrated could work quite well on the ground, but these were not sufficient in themselves to resolve the big picture problems. And indeed, the nature of the problem itself was evolving over time. The initial problem being to develop technical approaches to forest restoration. That morphed into a problem of empowering communities to take control of their forest resources and manage them sustainably. So not only were we changing the solution to the problem, indeed we were questioning the nature of the problem itself. And I think this is a pretty potent way to think about project management. This led us to a recognition pretty quickly that we needed to move from a forest-centered approach to a people-centered approach. So rather than thinking about what do we need to improve the forest, rather what do we need to improve people's ability to manage forests for their own benefit and well-being. This required us to engage with social scientists in a way that we hadn't done before, rather than have them as peripheral to provide advice, rather bring them centrally into the project structure. And this is really a totally new paradigm of forest development. A number of us have written extensively on this. I think a breakthrough on this journey was the work that was done by Bob Fisher and Isimod colleagues, where they did a characterization of Indigenous natural resource management institutions and systems, particularly in our case, Indigenous forest management systems, and the way we were able to pattern community forest user groups on these systems. This really was a quite significant breakthrough. It completely changed the way that we thought about fostering the development of community forest user groups and of interfacing between local and community, local and government interests. So the process of identifying user groups and interest groups, linking them to their forests, is essentially trying to rebuild, or in many cases strengthen, existing but often unseen Indigenous arrangements. And this is independent of the current administrative political boundaries. And this was critical. Again, it's one of the really, really important aspects that made this different from what happens in many other countries. The panchayat boundaries, administrative political boundaries, were no longer the boundaries of community forest user groups. I think this is one of the main reasons why community forest user groups have proven to be so resilient in the face of the many political and social changes in the intervening decades. So even with the revolution in 1990, the Maoist insurgency of 10 years, 1995 to 2005, I think, community forest user groups remained. In many cases, they were even strengthened because they became real locus of community power and in institution action.
Don, would you be able to wrap up in a couple of minutes? We are
Absolutely.
slightly lagging behind time. Yeah.
Last slide is on now.
Okay, brilliant.
This then led us to a conceptualization of a modality for community forestry. And this enabled the key elements to be easily conveyed and used for training, for developing training material. People would often say to us, well, yes, I can see a lot of the really good things that's happening within the project, but I still don't understand what community forestry looks like. And so we scratched our heads quite a bit and eventually had to try to articulate a concept for community forestry, which could be easily conveyed and discussed and debated and brought into the policy arena. I think the project team showed a desire and even a willingness to engage in the policy process in an attempt to bring field reality and conceptual rigor to inform the policy process. And so this provided critical input into the 1983 Act, the Master Plan for the Forestry Sector, the 1993 Act, and the subsequent community forestry rules and regulations. So they were critical in informing those important policy documents. Also, another factor that's often forgotten, I think, is that there was an openness, not always, but quite often within the senior parts of the bureaucracy for field experiments that had the potential to fundamentally alter the status quo. And this is a real challenge for bureaucrats anywhere in the world. I can recall that one particular secretary of the ministry said that we within the project had a mandate to go wider and further than others, to explore the possibilities of making community forestry work for people and forests. And the importance of a champion, key parts of bureaucracy, I think is a really, really critical aspect. Finally, most people in the project team had a willingness to write about and publish their evolving ideas and experiences and expose them to global scrutiny. This forced us to be rigorous in our own arguments and our own positions and to put it out for the world to see. Thank you, Hemant.
Thank you so much, Don. It's a fantastic recapitulation of how community forestry evolved in the 80s and 90s, and your own motivation as action researcher engaged in the not just in the job but in the challenge of intellectual discovery. So that's great to hear from you. And I'm sure many of the participants, now over 60, you may have questions and comments for Don and all the previous speakers. Please come forward and add your comments, questions on the chat. This will be recorded and would be a guide for learning for others who couldn't make it to the webinar today. So with this, I would now like to invite our fourth and very important speaker, Dr. Narayan Kaji Shrestha, who is a very familiar name in Nepal and internationally in the area of community-based resource management, and also right-based development in general. He has done tremendously important action research, participatory action research in the area of community forestry and natural resource management. He has his formal degree on education from Michigan State University, which he did in 1987, long back for many of us who are in the mid career or still emerging stage. So with those academic background, with that kind of academic background, another important intervention he has made in Nepal's community forestry development is to design innovative curriculum for what he called reorientation of professionals from previous paradigm to new community-based forestry governance paradigm. I have closely observed his work, and I have had the opportunity to work under his leadership and guidance in some occasions. So I have found those research, training, advocacy kind of work really influential in the development of community forestry, and also more generally in participatory development. He has been the founder of several civil society networks, including the key advisor and founding supporter of Fecofon and Himawanti, these kind of grassroots community networks who have emerged as key champions of community forestry. And Kaji Shrestha is also, I think, credited for taking community forestry from earlier stages of government initiation and bilateral project support to the new stage of civil society engagement and involvement. So that's a huge contribution. So we want to hear your reflections, Dr. Kaji Shrestha.
Thank you, Hemantaji. Jojoloppa. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can.
Very well. Please go ahead. I'd like to hear you.
Yeah, the question put to me was, how did I get involved in the community forestry? Before I go to that, I would like to remind all of the audience, in Nepal, there are two kinds of community forestry. One is the panchayat-based community forestry, and which is known as the panchayat forestry and panchayat protected forest. In a way, they have died now. And then another is the user-based community forestry. So I will be much more talking about the user-based community forestry. I'm not a forester. I'm from the education background. And I have been involved in many NGOs, civil society organizations. My belief is unless and until you have the participation of the people you work with, no development moves ahead. Top-down development approach don't bring the impact because there is no support from the beneficiaries. I think it was in 1984. I had come back from the Michigan State to collect data from my PhD thesis. Somehow, I think to bring me into the community forestry, I have to acknowledge Dr. Gilmore's support. Because that time for my survival, I was teaching Nepali language to the Australian experts, in which we used to talk about what they were doing, what is happening in the project also. In many ways, I would sort of a little bit critical that Nepal-Australia forestry project is very successful forestry project, but there is no community in their community forest. Probably Dr. Gilmore got that message, and around that time, one lady came to Nepal to study the community forestry process, and somehow Dr. Gilmore asked me to guide her, and she was a good colleague for me. And I came to know a lot about the community forest. One day, Dr. Gilmore came to me and said, okay, you are critical of our approach. Can you do something to find the ways so that we can have the right approach for the community forest? And I said, I'm not a forester. I have seen the forest, but I am not a forester. So how can I do that? But I can start the process. That process is if your DFOs, your rangers, assistant DFOs, and the forest experts come together and discuss. Let's have a sort of workshop, 3 days workshop, and try to find out the ways. It's very difficult to always realize the weaknesses and mistakes, but Dr. Gilmore was very willing. So we came together with the DFOs and also forest experts, and we started discussing. We started defining actually what is community forest, what is user group, what is participation, all these kind of things. And then we also tried to figure out the characteristics of those things. Then I asked participants to please rate, please evaluate yourself whether the project which have been doing all the participatory forestry was participatory or not. So some weaknesses and all these things came out. So then we started discussing then how to make it participatory. So we developed a guideline, very detailed guideline. But later on, Dr. Gilmore again said to me, you developed the guideline, but we have not field tested it. Can we do the field testing? So we went to Pandey Gaon of Kabre Palanchok, which had a 17 hectare of forest, and myself, Ghanendra Kafle, and Netra Tumba Ampe were 3 of us, and also some rangers and assistant DFO, for one day DFOs also, some advisors. Then we started the process. There was a difference of perception. It was clear because while we were walking to that area, we saw in one place there was a nice tree fell down, probably by the house owner. It was nearby a house. And the DFO asked me, you say that without people, we cannot manage the forest and people will participate in the forest. Did you see that good tree was fallen by that person? And I said, but please look at yourself, your policies. If he has not cut down that tree, you would have given the license for someone to cut it. But this person has protected that forest for a long time. So what is wrong with it? So we also went to go around the forest so that some ideas can be gained. And we saw many old and kind of trees is still there, but small twigs and other small trees are being cut. And then again, they asked me the question. So your users, your people are so clever. The growing trees are cut, but the old and dying trees are still there. And I said, again, look at your policies. If they cut those old trees, dying trees, they will have to use the excess. It makes noise. But if they cut the small twigs and trees, they can cut by using the kukuri easily, and they don't make noise. If they make noise, then your forester will come and prosecute them. So what's wrong with it? You look at the policies. Difficulties created by the policies, and then decide. So that was the kind of discussion I used to challenge. Somehow we spent about 2 weeks going each household and talking about and trying to implement our guidelines. Guidelines had to be changed. In the guideline, initially there was no interest group, but later on we realized that interest group is needed, especially to bring to consensus, because if we don't utilize all the needs and interests of the users, then they will again destroy the forest. For that reason, they have to come to consensus. So the idea of consensus also came after that. So somehow, 2 documents. It is realized that there is 2 documents needed. One document is how to manage the forest. So we came to address it as the operational management of the forest. And then there is a structure to oversee that operation. So that became the charter of the user group. There are 59 households. All the 59 households said, we like to be in the board, because we believed in the consensus and the participation of the users. If the users think that all 59 of them want to be the executive committee, why we should disturb it? Somehow, Dr. Gilmer knows what is the story after that. So we developed the process and concept with Nepal Australia Forestry Project. Then to further the process and the concept, we needed to communicate with the people. So that opportunity was given to me by the ISDP. Jane Grono. She came to me one day, ISDP has hired her as a consultant to develop the extension materials for the community forest. She has brought extension materials developed by the community forestry division, showed me all. It was all about how the forests are being cut down, what is the repercussion of those cut downs, and all these things, and how to develop the forest. I asked then, do you think that the people don't know about this? She said, probably they know. So why are you telling them about these things? And she said, but it was developed by the government, so I don't know. So why do you telling them? It's better if you find from them what is happening, what is their problems, and what are they facing now because of what is happening. You can learn from them, but also find out what they don't know. Do you know what they don't know? She said, probably I don't know. And I said, probably they don't know about the policies and procedures and all these things, government policies. But let's not assume. Let's have another kind of workshop with the forestry officials, rangers, and everybody. Because I never wanted to work myself, because I'm not a forester, I don't know. So there was Necros and DFO and
could you just wrap up in the next couple of minutes? We also wanted to hear your engagement around Francophone civil society as well, that part in the next decade perhaps.
Okay, it's almost finished. So they had 3 different workshops and developed the extension materials, which is the community forestry process as a it's the car driving, So that is still being used as the extension materials. Okay, it has all the processes which we had outlined in the Australian project. But there are 3 owners of the forest. One is the government. Okay. At that time, another was the panchayat. Third owner is the user. If all these 3 owners don't come together and come to consensus, there is no possibility of managing the forest. So we felt there is need for reorienting the forest officials. So then he started a orientation, 3 days orientation. It didn't work. Then we had 7 days. We had 15 days. At the last minute, we had 42 days of the orientation. That orientation was for the forest official, not for the forest official, because we came to realize forest officials have the limitation, and there was a lot of forest to be managed, forest to be developed. So we started training the local facilitators to actually facilitate the process of community forest, which took 42 days. Probably Hemataji also involved. Later on, we developed the same processes in the Tarai, where we said handover is not possible from the forest official, so we should start the takeover. So we also initiated a process of the takeover. That's how the community forest moved on. And there are Nepal, Australia for the process development, ISDP, Swiss for the extension materials development, then K3 or the British project for the reorientation and networking and other things. Okay, then should I move to the next question?
Next, just couple of minutes after 1993 legislation, your engagement towards civil society, especially Francophone, Imonti, those areas. Just a very quick so that participant can ask questions in the discussion round.
I think Dr. Dunn Gilmore did the higher level kind of thing, but there was, after the master plan was approved, there was a process to actually develop the legislation, and I don't remember the name, some Australians were proud, and he started framing the legislation, and he used to send all those he has developed to further comment to the projects, and we used to provide the project comment or feedback, but somehow that process was stopped. Then in 93, we heard, I stopped working with the community forestry project in 1991, started working with the NGO. And 1993, we heard that the Forest Act is being framed, and we are not allowed to actually participate. Somehow, with some influence with the forest minister, I was allowed to go inside, and I had to fight a lot to make that Forestry Act user-oriented. Somehow the Forestry Act came out as the user-oriented. In 1995, legislation was being framed. We are not allowed, no civil society, no user group, nobody was allowed. Somehow or other, it came out, but we put some pressure from outside. Anyhow, those somehow I started feeling that we will not be allowed to participate in the government process. And it's all right because we are not users. So they had the rights to question, why do you advocating? Because you are not the user. We knew that. So that's why the process of networking with the users started. And in 1995, Francophone was established so that they can advocate for themselves and the rights of the users. But somehow or other, women users started the issues. Our voices are not here. So that's why I started to raise the voices of the women users. Now, Francophone says that we put 50% of women in our committee, but no, they had said during that time that there are no women actually to represent the users. And being a WAS member, I had to say that we'll bring how many women you want, we'll bring. So that's how that 50% started, Then Himavanti also started. But later on, actually, community forestry movement moved so fast, there was no possibility of just by the forestry officials to actually fulfill those demands. So that's why we started training the outsiders as facilitators to facilitate the community forestry process. That's why this option is started. Community forestry supporters network can lobby for themselves. They can push forward the ideas. Okay, Hemantaji was also involved. We also had the Tarai Community Forestry Action Team, where we developed a lot of facilitators so that they can push the community forestry process in the Tarai. But forest officials did not budge, even they went to the court. That's why we started the process of taking over, not the handing over. Okay.
Okay, thank you
you.
so much, Kajidai. Yeah, very interesting, inspiring stories there. I'm sure our participants will pick up for comment and for the questions. We don't have much time. This is, I think, now the end of our four speakers' first round of presentation. All very inspiring, very diverse, covering all the way from 70s to of course 2000. We have not yet entered the contemporary discussion. That was of course not the purpose. The purpose was to hear the stories and reflections of early, pioneers, advocates. So with this, I would now like to invite Nayaji to moderate the discussions based on comments we have received from the chat, keeping our time limit in mind as well. Over to you, Nayaji.
Thank you. Thank you, Hemanji, and thank you all four speakers for your insightful share of your long experience in a very short time. Initially, we had planned 1.5 hours, but we passed that, and I request all of you to go another 30 minutes or slightly less, so that now we can finish in next 25 plus minutes. As we said earlier, we don't have time to interact bilaterally to all speakers. So some of the questions that are already there in the chat box, and others are continuing. So I just bring some of the questions, may not be all. And as Hemant was saying earlier, the primary purpose of this talk is not to debate on these contemporary issues around community forestry right now, but to learn best from our history, from our explorers, from our inventors, which can be useful for the current situation and also for shaping future of community forestry. I can see some of the questions from the chat box. For example, the idea of crisis or the rationalization of the restoration. So how that crisis came into a public discourse, or who brought that, and how does that help to actually mobilize communities and state agencies. So probably, Stephen, you would like to shed some lights on the regional context that was helpful, or that was encouraging people to find some alternative way. Stephen?
Thanks, Naya. Yes, look, it was very important. I mean, these things don't happen without money. And it was important for us to persuade people who had money to offer support to community forestry, which at that time was really an unproven quantity. People didn't know about it, and or they didn't understand how good it was. I was just reflecting on Dr. Shrestha's comment about being an outsider from the forestry community coming in to comment on community forestry. And I recalled the impact that a team from a group called New Era, I don't know if anyone remembers New Era, but they were a small consultant company in those days in 1980, and they did a very interesting report on community attitudes towards forestry. It was the first time where people had actually gone out and spoken to people about the forests and asked them what they thought, what they wanted from forests. And that was in 1980, and at that time it was considered a little bit revolutionary, and some people even questioned whether or not it was a wise spending of money. But I can tell you that New Era survey in 1980 did a lot to change perceptions. And those perceptions went wider than Nepal. We received many, many visitors from other projects asking us about this community forestry business. What mistakes are you making?
Good. there are also some questions around like even we are facing the state community kind of conflict these days, and certainly that was much more then when during the 70s and 80s. So even those difficult tension between the state and community people, and several of you talked about lack of trust or almost no trust or little trust. So in those difficult time, one of the challenge was how to bring these different in a way contesting actors together. Who would like to respond here? Someone else apart from Stephen?
Should I
Don?
go?
Okay.
Should I try?
Kajda, yes. A couple of 1 minute.
As I said, there are 3 owners in the forest. Is the somehow or other forest department or ministry has snatched the forest from the communities. So they have become owner. But originally, people were users were the owner. And somehow we introduced another layer, which is the local government. There are 3 owners right now. If the 3 owners don't come together and come to consensus, then the community forestry wouldn't work. So we made it clear that we cannot hand over the forest. Government officials would have to hand over the forest. So would government officials like rangers and DFOs would have to come together to, so we started reorientation. But we thought the local government will be with the communities because they are the voters of the local government. But somehow or other, that did not happen. Because my thesis is, of the 3 owners, whichever 2 owners are together, they will manage the forest. So users have become the outliers of now. In fact, the users are losing interest in the community forest management, which will have a detrimental effect in the community forestry of Nepal. Until now, they have not started, but it will have detrimental effect if the local government and the government forest department and forest ministry don't realize it.
Thank you, Dai.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daju. Maybe Tej Bahadur sir, Mahat sir, I would like to come back to you once very shortly on the questions around the lack of trust or little trust between state agencies and local communities, and in overall a hard working environment. So maybe some of your thoughts or some of your everyday experience in those days, how did you tackle with those situations then?
Well, thank you very much. I think before I go to Mr. Dr. Narayan Kaji's queries and questions and observations and presentation, I would like to just an observation I want to make is I think time and again, once more than once, is it that the community owned the forest, owning the forest. That's what he said. But I would say that that's not only reservation, that would not be a correct statement, because the forests are still owned by the government. It is the state that owns the forests of Nepal. And communities, we have got more than 22,000 community local communities involved in managing Nepal's forest, and they are managing the forest with use of rights. They use it, they manage it. They have got what they call now the work plans or something like that, and they use the products. They are authorized to use the products, but they are not given the ownership of that right. That will be far too far much expectation that. I think this is, I want to make it clear that it is not, the communities have not been given the ownership of the forest of Nepal, but they have been given the usufruct rights, using them, managing them, using them, and benefiting from them. This is what I think I would like to make that correction on Dr. Naran Kaji's observations. Thank you.
Thank you. We are approaching around 11:43 now, so we don't have much time, maybe 1 or 2 minutes maximum. So one of the common interest seems to be, your observation in contemporary community forestry in Nepal, and any lesson from your past, from those days to the current situation. Maybe half a minute. Anyone can check. So, Mahmood sir, you have any point here? Mahmood sir?
The question to me, okay. You see, as far as community forestry goes, I was involved only in the earliest days in Nepal. I'm talking in the field with the forest and soil and forest and the climate, etc. After that, I have all my association with has been more on what you call papers, and I've been in the academic side or research side, that sort of thing, but on desk and on forest. So I would not be able to tell you exactly how the for these forests, the ownership. What I can say that the basic tenets of the earliest thing that we presented and we went with, started with, that basic tenets still remains, that the forests are still owned by the state. It is still the government is the state is the owner of it, and the local communities are managing them with usufruct rights. They use it, and they what we call perhaps in forestry is MAICI, whatever we call it. We use whatever the additional we get product that they can use. They can use it, that one, but they don't have the right, or they are not the owners of it. So still the state and the government still remains the owner of the forest and not the community. They are users and managers. Yes,
thank you. Stephen, any thoughts for contemporary forestry? Yes.
Thanks, no. Look, I would like to remind everyone that this is an evolutionary process. I see in the comments that people were saying how old-fashioned it was back in the old days. Of course it was old-fashioned, but communities and thoughts and principles evolve, and we're on an evolutionary process. So a lot of those people who did all those wonderful things 40 years ago were trained in Dehradun, they were trained in classical forestry, but they made a change. So I don't think it's necessary to blame what happened in the past. We're evolving. Thanks.
Thank you. Don Gilmore.
Thanks, Ajay. I think there are particular challenges at the moment. The contemporary situation in Nepal with community forestry, I think, has thrown up all sorts of challenges, which are really quite new. From outside observers' perspective, I don't see that community forest has moved much in the last 30 years in terms of its overall modality and its approach. But the social, political, demographic, administrative situation has changed dramatically over the last decade. I don't think community forestry has adapted adequately to meet the current context. Context is important. I've stressed that in the first part of the formal presentation. There's a new context now, and I think to me one of the challenges is to look at, well, what happened in the past and why did it happen? Why were we able to do such really pretty good things in a very constraining administrative policy environment? And can we adopt those approaches in the contemporary situation with the new challenges that are there? I've debated for some time with colleagues that really we need to rethink the modality for community forestry. The modality that we have now is a modality that evolved in the late 1980s and was implemented in the 1990s. Is that modality relevant for the current situation? I'm not sure that it is. And so really we need to learn from the past and say, well, action research is an appropriate approach to explore the areas into the unknown. Everyone here signs on to that approach, I know that. It's still relevant, but the challenges are new and different. As Steve said, community forestry is evolving or should evolve. I don't think it's evolved much the last 20 years, but the context has changed dramatically. So I think we need perhaps a new type of community forestry to fit it for the current era. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Kazi Dai, do you have any last point?
Yes,
Go on.
I agree with Dr. Dunn Gilmore, because the context have changed, and according to that, the things process have to be changed. I agree with that, but it's the difference of perception between Dr. Math and myself. Dr. Math thinks that the government came early. I don't think that. People and the forest were earlier than the government. So owner of the forest were the people, not the government. And also now in the context of Nepal, people are sovereign. People can make the decisions. Government can be made by people. So we have to change our mentality. Also, I like to highlight just 2 sentences here. I am in the communities now. I saw one truck going from nearby, full of the forestry product, and I am talking with a small lady nearby, and the small lady says, look at the community forest. Contractors, foresters, and they are cutting all our trees and taking away somewhere. My small goat cannot go inside the forest. I am prosecuted. And some time ago, I went to Rauthat, community forestry chief, chairperson came to me and said, you invited us to manage the community forest, but we are not given any rights to use the forest because they have made so many issues on the operation plan, all these things and all these things. Now I am ready to actually hand over the forest to the government. That is the situation. Please look at these situations. I am pleading for the consensus of everybody, not one person imposing all the rules to others. Let's be democratic. Let's be participatory. Let's be consensus oriented. That's my argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kazi. Okay, thanks all 4 of you speakers. And well, we were not able to actually revisit all the questions and queries, unfortunately, but many of the responses are ongoing in the chat itself. So I'm going towards the end, and I will now invite as just an observer and with a few reflections. First, Dr. Srijana Baral, and forest expert. You have 3 to 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Naya, for this opportunity. Indeed, it's very overwhelming. I'm feeling very proud and very overwhelmed to hear from the pioneers on the community forestry, how were the days initially while they were starting the conservation models, different participatory conservation models in the countries. It's very nice, very interesting, and a very proud moment that I feel personally, and I also think many of us, the second generation foresters, feel about today's event. It's a very fruitful program to all of us, and it's a matter of pride that we have demonstrated a different conservation, participatory conservation model to the world, that participation is a key to conservation, key to success of the conservation. And those were the very, very overwhelming initial good days. The stories that I heard today from all of you, all the four speakers on the initial days, the stories of the struggle, the struggles to conserve the forest, because the people were blamed for not conserving, and there was and the achievements, the stories of achievements of different institutional changes that that occurred from the command and control to the partnership approaches. Those were the interesting stories that we heard, and how Dr. T.V.S. Moth demonstrated the forest without fences is possible, that people, the local communities, they are not the enemies of the forest, they are not the enemies of conservation. That was what was realized, and eventually introducing the social component into the technical domain, but blending the social and technical domains. What I heard from Naren Kajes were very interesting paradigms today. And Dr. Don Gilmore, I have always read you, and it is very nice to hear the history from you. You are a true history in the community forestry. But then, as you have all realized in the second part of the of your conversation of your talk, that the situation is changing. There are so many good things that happened. There are so many good achievements that we have realized, but then also there is a need to realize that there are different shades of gray, not black and white, and we need to adapt to those changes. And based on my studies and my research in the last almost a decade, I have come to realize that community forest is like, it's not being able to change itself with the changing social context. The society is changing. There is a changing relationship and linkages between people and forestry. There is a need to shift between a conservation era to conservation come utilization and an economic era. We need to benefit from what we are doing. Once I went to the field, and then I heard that there are generations who are participating in conservation of the forest, but then what benefit these communities have got? It's time that we need to reap, we need to harvest what we have planted, we need to reap our efforts in conservation. And it's 40 years, we are talking about 40 years of conservation, and it's time we reap the benefits. We give the benefits to the people, and we praise the people for their contribution to conservation. So I think like greening Nepal was not the only objective of community forest. Conserving forest resources was not the only objective. It has to change, it has to be dynamic, and it is an evolutionary process, as Stephen said. So we need to evolve the rationale for what we are doing in community forestry. It's time to read. And we need to ask ourselves, we need to rethink and reframe our approaches to community forestry. We are indeed a pioneer, and we need to prove it again and again that we are still at the top of our conservation model. So let's think, let's rethink from the participation itself, because participation cannot always be a voluntary process. There needs to be some livelihood opportunities that forest conservation will provide to them. There needs to be, there is always a question, what have we achieved? And let's get together to achieve, get something, get the economic benefit from the forest. So there are several other issues that we can see in the field. For example, like it's very difficult to get the timber out of the forest in the current situation. We have been struggling to get the timber out of the forest. We have been struggling to get the real participation of the people, because there is nothing that they are getting. They are like just we heard from Naren Kajisa that people are even ready to return back the community forest back to the government. So it's time to think. It's time to think and rethink that we need to have a better conservation model. We need to think differently on the participation and the benefit sharing mechanism. We need to think in different ways and terms how to engage women in conservation and how to engage them in the benefit sharing and in the timber business as well. So I think there are several ambiguities that are coming up in the current situation, especially focusing on in reaping the benefits of conservation and getting the timber out of the forest. There are several conversion processes and tax provisions that different tiers of government is imposing on the community forest. So I think we need to rethink over all of these. There should be some way forward on how communities should be engaged and how they should be getting benefits for their conservation efforts for this long 4 decades period. And that's all. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Srijana. Now I'll invite Dr. Sindhu Dungana, Joint Secretary at the Ministry of Forest and Environment, also a scholar on community forestry, but also an advocate from within. Sindhu, sir.
Okay, thank you, Nasser. This is actually a very important webinar we have organized. Just in 5 minutes, what I can say is all the 4 panelists or speakers actually tried to distinguish community forestry from other forms of forestry. And to me, it was, one key point all of them highlighted was the people, actually, people or the community. So that makes community forestry different from other forms of forestry or traditional forms of forestry. For that, for example, Professor
Sindhu, sir, your net is
not said he went to the village rather than, and also Stephen said DFO had to be diplomat forestry. As Gilmore said, they have to be using data. It's unfortunate power is off at the moment. Very, very interesting. You hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go on.
Hello. Okay. Fine. And Dr. Don Gilmore said they have to move from forest-centric to people-centric approach. And finally, Dr. Narayan Kaji Shrestha said, instead of learning from the department, we rightly asked the extension of the department and try to implement and try to make extension work in the village, and he rightly asked her to learn from the people and make an extension work. So that way, all of them, they distinguished the community forestry from other forms of forestry, keeping the people in mind, the people first. As Dr. Narayan Kaji also said, instead of talking about handing over forest, we need to move from handing over forest to taking over forest from the people. So theoretically, I can't say more with all of them. Having said that, probably this webinar, from what people try to, how they worked in the beginning of the community forestry, had they not initiated the things they told today, probably we would not have community forestry at this stage. So community forestry has come a long way. Now we have about 39-40% forest under community forest regime. About 23,000 groups working together. And having said that, I would like to raise a few points today. Number one, when we talk about community forestry, obviously, which was also raised by Dr. Narayan Kaji Shrestha, the control to community autonomy through a number of initiatives. Because there are different perspectives. So initiatives in the name of conservation narratives or technical inputs or development needs, or recently the federalization process. The province is also claiming over community forests. The local governments are also claiming over community forests. We foresters are also claiming community forests in the name of technical input. So that way, the control is still has still strengthened. So there is time to debate around how the autonomy of CF could be strengthened. The second one is, having said that, the second one is there is overall indifference of local people to forest management at the moment, probably because their needs are not met or their needs have been changed. For example, most people do not use firewood, most people do not use fodder, some people might be using fodder. So the needs of the people has shifted and people seem a little bit indifferent. I don't know, probably we should go back to the people. Instead of talking ourselves, we can ask people why they have been indifferent to people. Some people have been more active, for example, contractors and people who benefit more from forest. And another point I should raise now is, the issues of indigenous peoples and local communities emerging. At the moment in community forest, as Dr. Kaji said, a girl said she cannot have fodder from the forest, she cannot graze her goat, but timbers are coming. So that's the need of the local community. And also the indigenous peoples are also raising voices. For example, they have not been able to graze their yaks or cattle and all those things, and some traditional skills and knowledge being banished. That is also a case at the moment. And also the global phenomenon such as climate change, markets also impacting CF. We should also be considering important those points. And obviously, as we said, the community forestry is the only program that has 50% women leadership in community forestry user group at the moment, unlike in the very early stage. But we still need to capacitate people, women. The de facto leadership of women is needed. And finally, I would like to reconcile between Professor Mahat and Dr. Narayan Kaji Shrestha that who owns the forest is a big issue. So probably we need to think beyond the box, outside the box thinking. Why not to debate around we should be owning the forest rather than just fixing this is owned by the people or this is owned by the government. Probably that debate need to be with both the perspective need to be debated so that the community forestry is strengthened, people have more rights and forest benefits increased, and the governance is improved. Those things are the main point instead of by claiming who owns the forest. I think we should go move a little bit away from that debate to instead of claiming this authority owns the forest. So probably who should own the forest would be a new debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shindu sir, and Srijana madam. Now we have already crossed 12, so it's 2+ hours. I would like to go towards the closing of the webinar. And now I will invite Dr. E. Annenberg the associate professor at the University of Adelaide, Southern Australia, also the leader of our NLIT project here in Nepal. So Ian, you may like to thank all the speakers and others, and also close the meeting with some of your reflections of the webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this, Nair, and thank you, Nair and Hammett, for setting up this webinar. It's a wonderful format of communication. I mean, there's plenty being written, and there's still more to be written about the history of community forestry in Nepal, but to actually get the opportunity to meet some of the people who were instrumental in its history is a great privilege. So and I'm so happy to see so many people have turned up to this webinar. It shows that it's been a worthwhile effort. And of course, we will put it onto our websites and for posterity. And I will be watching how many clicks it gets. Look, there's no need really for me to wax on about the importance of the Himalayan forest, not just for the local people, the people who live in the forest, but also, you know, for the prosperity of Nepal, and also for the livelihoods of all the people who live in the watersheds of the Himalayan forest. So this is a very important issue, and it will remain to be a very important issue for a long period of time. And so that's why it's really important that people who come to work in this field, of course, Nepalis, but all of the international workers that come to work, have a thorough understanding of the history, the antecedent sort of to the situation we have now. I know when I first came into work on this project in 2012 for that workshop in Kathmandu, and later the project started in 2013, I must confess, as a biophysical scientist, I was at first confused, and then bewildered, and then exasperated at the complexity of the situation. And if it wasn't for the patience and the intelligence and goodwill of people like Nair and Hammett, who've taught me how to understand this very complex socio-ecological and political system, then I probably wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have lasted to come back for a second phase project. I think that's the important takeaway from all of this, is that okay, it is complex, and it's not just an ecological system. It's not just a socio-ecological system. It's a political system. And we can see by the fact that even in this webinar, we had political discourse going on and lively debate, which is good. And so it should be. I think so just to round it off, I really want to thank our speakers, Tobias Mahat, Stephen Midgley, Don Gilmore, Kaji Shrestha, and our Srijana and Baral Sindhu Dungana for your reflections as well. It's a great honor to be part of this. It's you know, I say I started this project in a cloud of confusion, but now I am I'm just fascinated by how this is evolving, and also have a great respect for people who work in forestry in Nepal, not only for their patience and intellect, but also their tenacity and capacity to be able to work in the uncertainty and the complexity of this situation, and work with goodwill from all sides, from the people in advocacy, for people in research, from people in government, and from last and certainly not least the people on the field and community forests. So it's a field of crucial work, not just for Nepal, but for the region. And I thank you all for attending. And for those who are listening to this webinar later on, I encourage you to maybe perhaps contact Forest Action for further information on what literature we have, which may help you grow in your understanding of this complex situation. So with that, I'd like to close the meeting, I suppose. Nair, unless you have, or Hemant have some closing words.
You are the closer.
So,
I am the
Ian, thank you
closing
so
words.
much. You have closed. Okay, thank you.
Well,
Bye bye.
I'll just
Yeah,
say, I'll
please.
show you where I am. I didn't get home in time to start the seminar. I started late, everybody. I'm up in the hills, the Adelaide Hills, and I didn't get home in time. And so I had to find a cabin. I found this lovely cabin made of Western red cedar imported from Northwest America. And if you can see it out there, it's a beautiful eucalyptus cameldulensis woodland. I'm looking out, and we're talking about the forests of Nepal. I'm surrounded by trees everywhere, and I'm very happy. And so thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I hope it's been as much benefit to you as it has been for myself and for the Enlift project. Namaste. Namaskar.
Namaste. Thank you so much, everyone.